On February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin, a black teenager, was shot by George Zimmerman. Witnesses at the trial gave very conflicting testimonies on what they saw. One woman at first said she saw men running in the street and getting into a fistfight. Later, her recount changed to just one person. No fistfight. Another witness said she saw two men wrestling on the ground after the shooting, but couldn't tell one from the other. Later, her account changed to identifying Zimmerman as the man on top. Recollections of Zimmerman's appearance changed for one witness, from bloody and in a state of shock, to calm and in control of his faculties. This is not an uncommon phenomenon when it comes to witness statements. Two people will often have two very different perceptions of what actually happens. Think for a moment of how two partners in a relationship might come away from an argument with vastly different perspectives of who is in the wrong and who is right. Often our impressions of a situation, place, or time period are heavily influenced by our personal biases and perspectives, rather than an objective analysis of reality. In other words, all this to say that relying on someone's personal account of just about anything is, if taken on its own, often highly unreliable. For example, just ask 10 random people about the political situation in America, and the more questions you ask, the more your responses will become less and less monolithic. If I tried to find out about America and its history solely through what average Americans on the street told me about it, I'd probably get a pretty inaccurate and incomplete view of things. After all, there are people that believe the world is flat. There are people that believe lizard people run the government. Which, I mean, okay, maybe. But in all seriousness, there are people that are wrong in more mundane ways, or half right, or mostly right, or completely right in some ways and completely wrong in others. And of course, perceptions of what's right or wrong in the first place shifts between the people who are told these things. We are all biased one way or another. We all have different perceptions of things. As such, while lived experience can be helpful, relying on someone's lived experience to get a broader idea of a group or system is often a very flawed idea if that is the only method you're using to gauge your understanding. Given the amount of propaganda the West has been fed about socialism, the idea of personal experience is especially unreliable when it comes to people's accounts of their experiences in socialist countries, given the fact that voices with negative experiences are naturally amplified by capitalistic interests in order to portray socialism as bad. With the amount of horror you hear about the Soviet Union, you might think that it must have been a complete dystopia. But, for example, a 2009 Pew poll shows that the reality is far more complex. Some people think things are better now than they were then, others think it's worse. But of course, those voices who are most willing to make the most outlandish claims about socialism are most likely to have their voices amplified, thus creating a distorted view of socialism as having only led to negative experiences. I talk more about some of the pitfalls of personal experience when it comes to socialism, relating to the book The Gulag Archipelago, as well as the testimonies of North Korea's two most famous defectors in the video linked at the top of the screen. But the examples of the flaws relating to personal experience that I want to discuss in this video in particular relates to Cuba. Almost every Cuban in Miami seems to have a story about how their regular, everyday, salt-of-the-earth Cuban grandparents had to flee the horrors of Fidel Castro. Of course, it's funny because no one's grandparents ever seem to be the same grandparents that owned slaves or worked with the mafia or prostitution rings or as Batista's police enforcers, which were pretty much the only people Castro imprisoned or executed, that is, if they didn't manage to escape the country. This is, of course, because any Cubans actually involved in these activities would much rather portray themselves as the innocent victims rather than actually admit to any horrible things they might have done. As another example of the flaws of relying on someone's personal experience, Nazi generals like Fritz Halder and Erich von Manstein, among numerous other Nazi generals, used their personal experience of fighting on the Eastern Front to tell racist lies about the Russians as relentless hordes and to extol their own tactical and strategic genius, while also deflecting any blame for war crimes on others or simply saying they had no idea. Countless times they were relied on for advice and stories, and given powerful military positions in organizations like NATO because, as Fritz Halder himself writes, of their apparently invaluable experience. Of course, the reasoning of personal experience not mattering can get really insidious, especially when Western, usually white academics write works on various countries they are not from, and then those same works often end up riddled with errors and misconceptions. But this is, of course, extremely common when it comes to academics writing about socialist states, as I discuss in more depth in my Red Scare video. As an example, in a 2012 poll of economists that asked whether Cuba's low per capita income growth has more to do with Cuba's own economic policies than with the US embargo on trade and tourism, 48% of economists agreed and 30% strongly agreed. And multiple economists in their responses clearly showed that they have no clue how the embargo actually works. At least this guy's confidence levels are rated a bit lower. But this one's my favorite though, very objective, level-headed economic analysis there. Well done. Of course, these people's analyses are incredibly inaccurate. In 1999, President Bill Clinton, under the Cuban Democracy Act, so-called, expanded the trade embargo by also threatening punishment of foreign subsidiaries of US companies that trade with Cuba. This meant that any company anywhere in the world that has business dealings in the US, in other words, an extremely large percentage of companies, will almost never trade with Cuba out of fear of punishment by the US. This is only one of numerous ways that the embargo is tended to very seriously damage Cuba. Oh, but don't worry, the US State Department under Bill Clinton also investigated Cuba and found that actually Cuba is at fault for it being poor, and that before Castro, Cuba was actually a decent place. Well, that's solved. Good thing the US cleared that up for us. But if the embargo isn't the fault of Cuba's condition, then what is the point of increasing the effects of the embargo in the first place? Why would the embargo exist at all if it wasn't having an effect? That's because, of course, the State Department is completely lying. As the main creator of the Cuban Democracy Act, Robert Torricelli, said, his main goal with the bill was to, quote, wreak havoc on that island. In the meantime, almost every country in the world, usually with the exception of just the US and Israel and sometimes a few others, strongly condemn the embargo and its effects. Of course, the loudest despisers of the Cuban government can't ever possibly admit that the US could ever possibly be remotely at fault for Cuba's current issues in any way, because it would harm their narrative of socialism being a disastrous, unsustainable ideology. These so-called patriotic Cubans would rather suck up to their oppressor than stand up for the country who dared to fight back against American imperialism. This disconnect from the truth is the reality in most countries, because not everyone is interested and has the time, money, and resources to take the time to be able to sift through what is fact and what is fiction. Lived experience might be important if you want to know things about the specific town or city that the person lives in, but it alone doesn't mean much in terms of gauging someone's knowledge about a country's past or current as a whole. I mean, at the very least, if you're going to rely on personal experience, then why not listen to both sides? But of course, that's the problem. What is more annoying than anything is the double standard. People who claim negative experiences under socialism widely have their narratives accepted by people on all parts of the political spectrum. Stop talking so much shit changing the subject. How about asking the real Cuban people what they really want and need? Every older Cuban that lived before 1959 will tell you how great of a country actually Cuba was for Cubans. But anyone who claims positive experiences under socialism, like Luna Oy, is met with tons of skepticism. You're a spy, you're brainwashed, you're propagandized or a propagandist, even though all political influencers are propagandists to some extent. And believe it or not, there are people who live in Cuba and will stand with the government of Cuba despite its flaws.
Because I'm convinced that this is the country that I want to defend. That's why I'm here, to support my leadership and my people.
The fact that many people's instant reaction to seeing something like this is that this person must be propagandized or a paid shill is dehumanizing and it's patronizing. It's a lot of things. We in the West unquestionably accept the narratives we're told about countries that don't follow our model, and heavily scrutinize, if not outright deny, any evidence that strays from this narrative even slightly, and it's sad. In conclusion, I'm not saying people who have personal experience with something do not have invaluable input to add, whether that is positive or negative. But the simple fact that they have personal experience, or claim that they have personal experience at least, should not ever be used by anyone as a crutch in and of itself to justify the things they claim, especially when it comes to talking about socialist states, given how often those same detractors usually lost material wealth or power because of that state, and as such it would be in their best interests to make that state look as bad as possible. Well, that's about all I have to say for this video. Please feel free to like, subscribe, and comment if you want more videos like this one, and also follow me on Twitter, and I will see you next time.